I'm a great privilege to be here with two such distinguished colleagues and experts. In the United Kingdom at the moment, we're mostly obsessed by whether our esteemed Prime Minister partied much last year or not. So I'm afraid lifting our heads to look at bigger issues is a bit of a luxury. But I mean, this is an important issue. And I've got two comments. First is really about what the outcome might be. And the second is, how did we get to where we are now? Professor Mahbubani talked about, the Asian century. In a sense, a bit like the Nash, kind of equilibrium. It would be good if we had a century where everyone felt they were the winner, a human century, as it were. In a recent book on existential problems facing humanity, an Oxford-based futurologist, Toby Ord, didn't mention China, I think, once. He mentioned climate change, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence, and pandemics, and meteors clashing into the Earth, which is somewhat unlikely. But he didn't mention China. And yet we have got to this situation where China almost obsesses a large number of our political elite in Europe and particularly in America, and where even saying that we need to have dialogue has become a difficult thing sometimes. And that seems a strange situation to end up in. As Professor Calder has said, it's not like we have just arrived at a moment when China is prominent. This has been happening for 40 years. And yet, despite all of the evidence and the economic indicators and all of the accumulation of different very strong signs that China is becoming much more significant, suddenly there's this extraordinary panic. And I find that puzzling. An example is the very odd story of a Chinese, a lady of Chinese heritage in the UK who has been accused of trying to influence politicians here from our domestic security MI5. I mean, if one looks at this story, it's very hard to work out what the story is. People try to influence politicians. Sometimes politicians try to be influenced. If we have a problem, it's the funding of politics and political parties, particularly in the UK, probably in America. And that seems to be more important than whether a particular person is trying to have influence, because in this case, I wouldn't say it was a very successful outcome. When we look at the really strange and panicky and, kind of weird situation at the moment, I do remember about 13 years ago during the great economic crisis, when Chinese investments sort of first really started to appear in London. And there was a lot of discussion in the media about how China was going to buy up the world. Well, of course, that didn't happen. But what I do remember at that time were many people who were interviewed about, should we be worried about Chinese investment, saying very strongly that this was not an issue because we set the rules in our own environments. I mean, about 13 years ago, Chinese investment first started to appear in Europe. And I remember at the time, the position was that we should not be worried about this because our rules and regulations were strong enough to deal with this new phenomena. And that confidence seems to have gone, particularly here and in America and in Australia. There is this odd story of how China is a very, very strong threat to our values, our systems, and it seems to go a long way beyond the evidence. And it seems to make China into a problem, which is a different kind of problem to what it might be. This is not about Asia in particular, it's about China. I suppose the final thing then I have to say is that what really puzzles me in this situation we're in now is for Europeans, China and Asia are not new. We have been interacting for 500, 600 years. We have a long history. Henry just referred to a book coming out this year. It's actually not my book, it's a collection of the key documents by major European figures over the last 500 years about China. These are not China experts. They are major intellectual figures. Leibniz, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Marx, Hegel, Max Weber, Bertrand Russell, Roland Barthes. I mean, very significant figures who wrote about China. The pattern that you get over that 500 years is broadly two narratives, two stories. On the one hand, to idealize China, and the other, to be fearful and demonize it. Leibniz, I suppose, represents the idealization, and Voltaire. They regarded China with its Confucian meritocratic system as a valid alternative for what Europeans were doing at the time in the Enlightenment. And that has continued down to the present day. On the other hand, figures like Montesquieu wrote of China as being an oriental despotic place that we shouldn't copy. Now, in the narratives that we have available, at least in Europe, and it seems to be the case in America and Australia too, I don't see that fundamental structure has changed. It's either to idealize, to look at China as some enormous trade and economic opportunity, or to regard it as a huge political and geopolitical threat. There are two problems with that to conclude. The first is, if you regard China in particular, and other partners in Asia too, as such major problems, how are we going to have a global system to confront the existential problems I talked about earlier, which don't recognize and respect country boundaries? But secondly, with these very extreme narratives, we don't have the tools in our media, in our politics, in our public discourse and debate to deal with what is clearly a very complicated situation. We are trying to use pre-Newtonian physics to deal with a quantum era. This is very, very, disastrous. So I think, finally, we've had the kind of introduction of relativity into physics. We certainly need it into geopolitics. I don't see why we are still haunted by storylines that were put in place 500 years ago that have not been radically contested. And I think that that is an urgent job. It's a job we have to do together to create a more adequate story and a more adequate narrative for clearly an enormously challenging period that we're all moving into. Thank you very much.